resident, and he's here for the next, I think there's 4 more weeks in your residency, investigating all things board games, which we're excited to dig into today, and especially those online, welcome. If you have questions, just, will we field them at the end? Okay, we'll hear from Dr. Michael for a while, and then we'll field some questions at the end.
Agus tapalid una ag Beinn Mhàbu an turam a horsglas, an choram show a horsglas. I come touch on the show in Munchen a second. Many thanks to all of you at Beinn Mhàbu for giving me this opportunity to be the artist in residence for a while, looking at board games. I, of course, like most people, realize that there's such a strong music and dance tradition in the area. I'm sure this came as something quite unusual and far afield, given that board games, as I'll be discussing, is something fairly new for the Gaelic world. And I think really a good time is ripe to think about this and many other aspects of Gaelic. So this is a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about games, board games in general, how diverse they are at the present, and a few examples of them. And then talk more specifically about board games in Gaelic culture historically, the games that exist that to various degrees draw on Gaelic culture, and then talk about my own processes in developing board games. But I thought that maybe I would first start with a few caveats or apologies. Like you, there might be a voice in the back of your head saying, games? Are you serious? Like, look at the state of the world. We're in a major ecological crisis. We've got the rise of fascism. We've got democratic deficits and crises happening all over the place. Why are you talking about games? But I think, in my opinion, so many of the crises that we face currently in the world depend on us finding a foundation in our lives based on community. Community is the linchpin for addressing so many of what seem to be huge problems. And if we can use games as they have been used in the past to think strategically, to model things, and most importantly, to build relationships between one another, then that is a good use of board games. I also want to say that I'm not going to be talking about revitalization in general. There are scholars who specialize on that and who can speak to those issues in a more theoretical way. I'm just going to be really talking about games, specifically and their role in the world widely and in Gaelic in particular. And also I want to say that I'm not going to be talking about computer games, internet games, things that are electronic, digital, and so on. In my opinion, it's much more important for us to be thinking about board games for a few reasons. One is that electronic games, video games, internet games require massive resources to produce, and also they consume massive resources to play. Not only that, but they are part of this kind of wider nexus of a social alienation. What we need are games that bring people together physically, and this is especially the case in terms of language use and language revitalization. We need people to be amongst one another and getting to know each other personally and using the knowledge and sharing the knowledge and enjoying the knowledge and traditions that exist, and finding ways to reclaim and strengthen them. All right, so given those caveats and apologies, I'll move on. So how can games be useful? How can they be used? Well, first of all, as I'll show you many examples of, games can be used to highlight various aspects of culture and history and tradition, worldview, and so on, in ways that are really fun and entertaining. Very different from kind of the standard, like, let's learn from this textbook and, think critically. There are many ways in which they can be used to think critically, but in ways that are fun and engaging and entertaining. Not only that, but there are amazing stories, of course, in Gaelic literature that are centuries and millennia old, and As we can see in other games, this is one of the few arenas or forums in which people are actually engaging with stories and creating narratives out of these elements in the present. You know, there are some places, some limited forums where people are doing storytelling in a traditional manner, but I think that in the present, the most active, productive in which young people are engaging in narratives are actually around board games. So we shouldn't neglect that and think that we're above that and better than that. This is an opportunity that we can take. Not only that, when you look at games, a lot of them are really beautiful. I mean, they are works of art, and they're very highly aesthetically pleasing, and they create an atmosphere and a kind of environment which is very conducive to engaging with the past in a very pleasant and fun way. We can target specific kinds of language use, specific kinds of audiences with these games, and again, this is very relevant when we're thinking about language revitalization and engagement with various aspects of culture and history. And because of that, we can use these for language learning. So if you're learning a language, there's an infinite number of things you can talk about, and that's very demanding in terms of a lexicon. Like, you have to know any random number of words, but if you're playing a game, you have a very limited set of terms and verbs that you need to know. You can learn those things and then put your language to use in that very limited universe of discourse. And having these kinds of tools, these kinds of artistic products, I would say can help to enhance the prestige and the sense of status of a language or a culture or a tradition. And again, I think you'll see that there are opportunities that other groups are taking to do this, and I don't think that Gaels should be the last to think about doing this. So it wasn't until really a few years ago when I really started engaging with the possibilities that I realized really how big of a market there is, how much of an explosion of ideas and creativity have been going into board games in the last couple of decades. There's really been a massive boom in this creative space. For example, like my main source is a website called Board Game Geek. And on that website, there are over 125,000 games, a massive number of games. Almost any subject you can think of has a game that allows you to play it with other people, whether it be, literally like foraging for mushrooms or growing beans or sewing baskets, whatever you can think of as a board game that allows you to engage in those things, except, of course, things related to Gaelic, which I'll get to. So why should we allow ourselves to miss out on this opportunity? In general, it is the case, like with any kind of domain around capitalism, they tend to cater for the mass market, but there are many niche games as well. And again, like there are ways, I think, of positioning Gaelic-oriented games that could be both mainstream and kind of niche to allow it to be used for Gaelic-oriented purposes. And just to give you a sense of that size, last year, the board game industry was worth an estimated $13 billion, and that's US dollars. So this is a massive, massive field of entertainment. So there's many ways of kind of categorizing or thinking about the nature of these games, and I'm not going to attempt to give you a thorough kind of genre system, but here are some ways of kind of thinking about the ways that games play. There are games based on communication, so you're trying to communicate something to people, like charades or charades, right? You have a word or idea or a name or a title in mind, and you're trying to communicate it in some way. I actually played a game like this last night for the first time called Just One Word, I think it's called. So there's lots of communication games. Then there's games that are about patterns, like trying to find various kinds of patterns, collecting them, identifying them, putting together patterns in various ways, whether it be colors or numbers or shapes or what have you. Then there are strategy games in which you have kind of some kind of large-scale phenomena, like wars between kingdoms. And essentially, you have a number of rules, you have a number of units, and you are sort of a leader on one side who's moving around these units and then kind of battling or competing with the other side in some way. So those are sort of strategy games. Then you've got engine building games where you start out with some kind of resource and some sort of set of rules about how you manage those resources and increase those resources and move them around. And in these kinds of games, you're sort of like a god, because there's no other kind of entity that can have such a massive impact, but you're kind of modeling larger scale phenomena. And then finally, you have role-playing games. Now again, this is not exhaustive. These are just a few categories that I think might be useful for thinking about games. And in role-playing games, you are a first-person, character. Like you are playing the part of some character in a story, and you're making the decisions for them and interacting with the world in various ways. So those are some big categories. But underneath those games, there are other kinds of decisions. Like, is it a game that is a solo game for one player? Is it a game where people are competing with one another? Are you cooperating? Semi-cooperative means you are working together sometimes, but in some ways you are competing against each other. So there's various ways of organizing that. You can play as individuals or on teams, and sometimes you are competing not against each other, but what sometimes people call AI, like some way of modeling another entity in the game that you are competing against, but it's not another player. You can have games that only last 30 minutes, and then you've got games that will allow you to play kind of scenarios that go on and on for months. People play these games for very extended time periods. You can have elements of the games that are purely luck, like drawing a card or throwing dice, or you can have games that are very deterministic. So you always know, in this situation, this is going to always produce that. You can have games that are a fixed order, like you always go in a certain order, or that order gets randomized in some way, or people play at the same time. And you can have games that look for some certain condition to say, okay, you're done now, or some other thing can trigger the win or lose, or it can be until you're just tired of playing it. And then underneath all of that, you've got a bunch of what are called mechanics. So these, again, I'm going to Board Game Geek as sort of my major source for these things. And these are kind of the little pieces that you put together to make a game, like dice, for example, or using cards to randomly distribute power, or doing auctions, or using timers. So again, using Board Game Geek's list, they list 327 mechanics. So again, there's lots of ways of kind of packaging up these little devices or little tricks that you put together to model things to make a game. So I'll just give you a few examples of games. Now, many of these I've played, but I haven't played all of them. I'm just kind of going to try to give you some examples. So Dixit is a very simple game, but it's very fun. It's a communication game. And as you can see, the artwork is really beautiful. It's very surreal. And it has lots of little details and things you can describe. So the point of the game is you're playing with several people, and you want to be able to communicate which card is yours amongst several cards, but only have that understood by a limited number of people in the group. It has to be at least one person, but not everybody. So you have to communicate in very specific and kind of coded ways. Kind of the most, one of the most compelling things about the game is the artwork and the kind of theme and atmosphere that it creates. Then there's Ticket to Ride. Have any of you played Ticket to Ride before? It's a really fun game. It's very simple to teach. It's a color-coded kind of game in which you're doing kind of set collections that give you the train compartments that you need, and then you've got a bunch of potential routes around some map. There's maps of Europe, there's maps of North America, probably other places too. Those are the two locations that I've played. And at the beginning of the game, each player gets 3 different routes that they need to complete between two destinations, or source and destinations. So you have to complete those and get the points for that, or else lose points for not doing it. So you're competing for those tracks amongst the players that you can get between those points in numerous ways. So it's a really fun kind of set collection, competition, route making across maps. My daughter's favorite game is this game, Star Wars, the deck building game. So deck building is where you start out with some limited number of cards, and then you have some way of getting more cards that are increasingly powerful that give you abilities to kind of increase your power. And in this game, kind of the theme or the background is the Star Wars story. So you've got all the characters have different, abilities on them. The abilities are like your attack points, your force strength, and your kind of your wealth that you can use to buy other cards. And you're sort of gathering more cards, using cards to attack, and then getting attacked. And each player has some base that they're trying to protect. You also have ships that are available. So it's definitely a very cutthroat game because one side is playing the Empire and the other side is playing the Rebellion. But this could be anything, but because it's the Star Wars universe, that people are familiar with the story, and you're able to kind of insert your knowledge of the characters and the theme into the game as you're playing it. This is a really interesting role-playing game. I have not played it, but I've read a lot about it and I watched videos about it. And in this game, you have this massive landscape that you're exploring on these maps. And the landscape has all these different locations where you can find things, interact with other characters, and your characters have certain abilities and objects that they can use. And then you come across various enemies or monsters here that you fight, and you deal death in various ways in a kind of a puzzle kind of way. So there's a lot of exploration and a lot of kind of choose your own adventure. Do I do this or do I do that? And based on the statistics of the characters you have, the objects you have, some choices are easier than others. And then of course you can get attacked or have danger presented to you that you have to respond to. The world that's created here is like a custom world, and this is often the case with these games. The game players generally, they either go to something like Star Wars or Dune or Lord of the Rings that people know kind of the themes and the stories and the characters, or else they create their own. That's generally kind of the background of the worlds that they're playing in. Now, these games, they're very fun, very compelling, but there's been a number of critiques about the games, and certain things that make them problematic to various people. So there's a very common genre of games which is referred to as 4X games. And the X's are explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate, because they're highly competitive. You're kind of competing with one another in a landscape, in a territory, and trying to create dominance. So it's pretty obvious that these games mimic the violence and the exploitation that we have in the history of empires and colonialism and so on. So a lot of people, find these games problematic from that point of view. There are a lot of games that focus on the acquisitions of goods, like getting better swords or stronger armor or fancier spaceships or what have you. And of course, game companies themselves like to create and sell expansions because it means they're selling you more stuff, right? So there's an obvious critique of capitalism that enters into, viewing or critiquing those games. Many of them reinforce the myth of progress. So especially these games that are engine building games are very much building into that idea of development and the problematic nature of development. And then many of them are kind of echoing or representing the history of empires and want you to identify with one of a number of empires, like the Romans or the Egyptians or the English or what have you. Many of the games, of course, are competitive. So, there's kind of a winner-take-all, like either I win the continent or, nobody does. Or, somebody else does, I should say. Again, because these are mass market games and these are sold by companies that want to make a profit, quite often there's very little representation of marginalized groups. You're kind of selling to the least common denominator, to things that everybody knows about, rather than more niche topics. However, in recent years, these issues have been addressed by board gamers in a number of ways that I'll show here. So, first of all, there's the notion that you can take these mechanics and do something different with them. Now, this is one of the best, probably the best example that I've seen so far, and I've read about it on their blog and watched the video, but this game is not out yet. It's kind of on the verge of being released. And this is one of the most impressive examples of, I think, kind of writing back to, or creating back to the kind of imperial capitalist machine. So this is a cooperative game, or semi-cooperative game, which is based on Cherokee tradition. You can see on the cards that they're using the Cherokee syllabary with Cherokee words, and not only that, but the whole game is based on Cherokee folklore and tradition. And the story is, or the setting is of a Cherokee village, and you are controlling animals that have an effect on the villagers, and you're trying to produce enough for the village to survive through the winter, but you don't want to overproduce because you get dinged if you do that. And storytelling itself figures very strongly in the game. Now, again, I can't speak to the details because I haven't played it, but from what I can see, this is like a really super good example because you have that kind of cooperative nature of the game, working within a Cherokee, worldview and a Cherokee value system. And they worked with people in Cherokee communities to come up and work through this design for the game. Now, I don't know if they have plans to make this all playable through the medium of Cherokee, but you can see that at least the syllabary and the language is represented in the game itself. So hopefully that would lend itself to being the game being easily adapted within a Cherokee-speaking environment. And Gaelic is in bad shape, but Cherokee is in a really desperate shape. So hopefully games like this will give younger people new ways to engage with their language and culture. Then there are games that highlight the irony and extremes of the kinds of problems I was talking about. And one really good example is this game called John Company. Now, I've not played this game, I've just read about it. But in the game, you are representing various agents and entities that are involved in the colonization of India, and specifically in the British East India Company, which was notorious for its degree of exploitation and violence. And so in this game, you are very explicitly given choices that underline the immorality of colonialism. You have these choices that are all about cutthroat competition, taking bribes, offering bribes, exercising nepotism, using blackmail and plunder to enrich yourself. So this is kind of laying bare the kinds of injustices that were involved in 4X, what we're seeing in 4X games, of making it very explicit and kind of ironic. So imagine a game about the Irish famine, where you get to, revel in the ravages of the potato blight and take advantage of the starving people in Ireland and take over their lands and withhold food from them to give to other people in Britain, and putting them on boats. Or a game about the clearances, where you are representing an agent of an estate, where you get to burn people's houses, take their furniture and their homes and put them on boats and be rewarded for that, right? That would really highlight what was going on at the time in a very explicit way. Then there are games that reverse that kind of 4X thing and allow you to play from the perspective of the natives. And one of the most successful, well, probably the most successful game of this genre is one called Spirit Island. And this game is a cooperative game, and you are playing the spirits of this island who are trying to protect the natives of the island from these various colonists that are arriving. So you have energy points which you are using strategically to awaken various energies of these gods. And what the gods are doing are they're inflicting fear and panic and terror amongst these colonists to get them to leave the island. So, a very explicit, critique of settler colonialism. And the colonists themselves are not being played by a player, but they're kind of being automated by various mechanics in the game itself. Now, I've kind of taken elements of this for one of the games that I'm designing that I'll talk about later, but it's a really interesting idea about kind of reversing the meaning and the usage of these mechanics. Then there are games that center the non-human. Rather than representing human beings that are exploiting the environment, you are trying to help the animals and the plant life of the environment to thrive. And I think that as far as I know, the most successful game of this sort is a game called Wingspan. And in this game, there are 170 different bird species, and you are trying to help the birds to survive by managing, their habitats, where they're laying their eggs, how they're getting fed, and so on. So this is, a tableau. That means it's a set of cards that you're laying out and using an engine to ensure that they're going to thrive, these various species, across these different habitats that you're able to put the species in. So let's now go into games in Gaelic history. And I'm just going to kind of preemptively say it's not unusual when you present a certain idea to folks in the Gaelic community. They'll say, well, we never did that in our village. Because their view of Gaelic culture is based on their own living memory and people around them. And they say, well, we never did that. But if you go back a little bit further in time, you see that there was something in Gaelic culture, and games are one of these examples. Of course, nowadays, the games that people play are very much fairly recent imports, like cards and so on. But if we go back a little bit in time, a few generations, we can see that games actually had a very strong presence in Gaelic culture, and it goes back to at least the Iron Age. So in this image you see on the right, this is from an archaeological dig in Colchester. So this is northern England, essentially, but of course at this time period, in the very early, first century, the Common Era, so shortly around the time of Roman invasion. This is the remnants of pieces from a board game in a grave. And of course, this meant that this must have been something of high prestige and social status that the dead would have wanted to do in the afterlife, because, if games are fun now, why not after you die, right? And so we know from archaeological digs from the Iron Age, at least as far back as that games of various sorts are being played. And we also know, because of the remnants of names for games in the Celtic languages. And this is a really interesting example. So in the early Gaelic texts, there is a game called Fiadh. That would be the modern Gaelic rendering, Fiadh, so wood sense or wood intelligence. And the same name exists in the Brittonic languages, so in other words, like Welsh. And in Welsh, it would be Gwyddviol, or Gwyddviol. I'm sorry, I'm not a Welsh speaker. The fact that these two names are obviously from the same origin tells us that the name is very old. And it's very interesting to me, with all the work I've done on trees, about how this word for wood is in the name of the game, as well as the idea of intelligence. So games, of course, are testing and developing your strategic thinking and your intelligence, the kind of way that leaders need to have. So, we know from plenty of sources that the Gaelic elite were being taught games specifically for these reasons, because as leaders, they had to be able to think strategically and use games as kind of a pastime in that kind of way. And it was not unusual, too, to see that the outcome of these games, people would bet on them, who was going to win and who would lose. And I've got a few interesting and sometimes kind of funny examples of this from very early Gaelic texts. So many of you would have heard of the text called the Táin Bócúile, the cattle raid of Cooley is the English translation. This is a quick little excerpt from that. But on the right, you can see, again, a very early grave that had game pieces in it. This time it's in Nath, so that is in Ireland, in the east of Ireland, not far from like Newgrange and Tara. And it's in that period, kind of slightly before or maybe just after the Roman invasion. We don't have an exact time period, but again, it tells us that, all over the Celtic world at that time period, the late Iron Age, people are playing games. In any case, this is kind of a fun little example here from this text. And this text would be, I think, about the 9th century. A year before these events in the Táin Bó Bricrú had come from one province to another begging from Fergus, and Fergus had retained him in his service, waiting for his chattels and wealth. And a quarrel arose between him and Fergus as they were playing a board game, and Bricrú spoke very insultingly to Fergus. Fergus struck him with his fist and with the game piece that he held in his hand, and drove the game piece into his head and broke a bone in his skull. And so this is maybe one of the more bigger dangers of playing board games with people. And it reminds me of the scene in Star Wars where they say, well, just let the Wookiee win. Right? It's kind of an echo of that to me in this little excerpt. And now what about Scotland itself? Right, here are some game pieces found in another site in Aberdeenshire, again to the early centuries of the Common Era, about when the Romans were starting to move north. So again, showing us games were played all over, and of course these pieces that remain tend to be high status, things that would have been played amongst the elite, so they're very, very fine game pieces. This is another text which I think is about the 9th century. I forgot to look up dates, but that would be my guess off the top of my head. Shall we play at a board game, said Migyud. What shall be the prize for winning, said Yochi. The prize that either of us shall wish, said Migyud. That day Yochi lost the stakes of the game. You have taken my stake, said Yochi. Had I wished, I could have taken it before now, said Migyud. What would you have from me, said Yochi. My arms around the time, which is a woman, and a kiss from her. So the stakes for the game could be very high indeed, and there are echoes of this very same thing about, sex as a game, or love and romance as a game, in texts from the Gaelic world at a much later date, from the late medieval period. Here's another really good example. I think this is about, the 11th century, if I recall correctly. There is a young man at the door, he said, and his name shall be the Ildanach, the master of all arts. For all the things the people of your house can do, he himself is able to do every one of them. Try him to the game boards, said Nuaga. So the game boards were brought out, and every game that was played, Lug won it. And when Nuaga was told that, he said, let him in, for no one like him had ever come into Tara before. So we see that board games are a test of intelligence and mastery of many sorts, and that is a test for letting in Lug. So obviously board games, hopefully I don't have to convince you more, these are very much a part of Gaelic culture and in fostering and developing intelligence and leadership skills. Another really interesting example of board gaming pieces there from the early medieval period. And those of you who are really familiar with Gaelic oral tales, even into the 20th century, will know that there is a tale that was told in Scotland, Ireland, Nova Scotia, about the Fianna and how Diarmid is hiding from Fionn because he's afraid of Fionn's wrath because Grania has forced him to elope with her, and so they're hiding, and Fionn is playing a board game, and Diarmid is hiding in the tree right above him, and Diarmid is helping Fionn's opponent play this game. He does so by dropping little berries that fall on the board game to show the opponent where to go. So this is a really kind of funny, use of games in the story, but it says something about, again, kind of pastimes of people, especially the intelligentsia, and strategy and competition in the Gaelic world. Now, not only that, but there's a game with kind of very modern kind of resonances that again lasted into the 20th century, associated with the fianna, goes back to at least the high medieval times in the Gaelic world. That's the Muintir Ing is Ruang, where it's sort of a geometrical game where you have this pattern of these two kinds of figures, and the story is you have to save them from drowning on this boat, and you have to eliminate certain ones of them until there are few enough that they will be saved. And so it's it has a lot of kind of echoes of a lot of modern pattern and strategy games. And then you'll notice from the title of this talk, there'll be a faram and Tàilisg. There will be kind of noise or rumblings on the game table. That there are a lot of references in Gaelic poetry of the 17th and 18th century of people in the halls of the chieftains playing board games, playing card games, and dice games. So this is something that was widespread in Gaelic society, playing their own games in their own language until fairly recently. So let me talk a little bit about modern board games and the representation or lack thereof of Gaeldom, of Gaelic topics. So there's a massive number of games that glorify various empires, especially the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the English, just as you would expect. So just to give you some specific numbers, and these categories are created by people who are on Board Game Geek, who classify things, so they're not necessarily terribly accurate, but just using the numbers that exist, there are 128 games associated with Norse mythology, 194 associated with Greek mythology, 72 associated with Egyptian mythology, and 31 associated with Celtic mythology. So it's pretty meager pickings. And if you go to that actual list, I don't know why some of them are there. They don't really look relevant to me. But there's two or three that are not on there that really should be. But anyway, this gives you a sense of what a huge gap there is. As you might expect, one of the most popular ones are the Vikings. They fit very well into that 4X kind of paradigm. You go on your long ship and you go find new lands and you battle the natives and you exploit their resources and settle their lands. So the popular notion, anyway, of the Vikings and the Norse fit very well into that kind of scheme. And those of you who know me know I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about the Norse and the Vikings because they often are glorified for reasons that go back to 19th century racism, and they obscure the history of the Gaels. They're almost always where Gaels, quite often where Gaels ought to be and ought to be represented. And not only that, you get a lot of games that are supposedly about the Norse that are ornamented with Celtic knotwork. Now, there was a period during that high medieval period when you have kind of a fusion of Norse styles and Gaelic styles. So there is, a genuine kind of hybridization that is, not inaccurate to represent. But quite often they're using styles that are really that are before that fusion period, before the Viking kind of hybridization. So anyway, that's my usual bee in my bonnet. And in general, this is kind of a problem that we get. We have these games who want to have, nice ornamentation, nice artwork, but they're kind of a more general or vague or other topics, like generally the medieval European setting somewhere, or kind of this very fantastical, invented, imaginary past, but they're using Celtic knotwork and other aspects of, Celtic art and Celtic or Gaelic tradition to give them that atmosphere and that flavor, but there's no content there. It is, I think, appropriate to say this is cultural appropriation. And again, this is a chance for Gaels to step up and say, well, we want to use that in something that's appropriate. And then there's games that are supposedly about Scottish themes, more specifically within a Scottish context, but it's the same kind of problem. You're using the theme, but there's no real substance there in terms of something specific and accurately modeling what was in a Scottish context. So to give you a few examples, so there's a game called Isle of Skye, from chieftain to king. So you think, this must be showing something about, the Gaelic world, right? But it's really not. It's just what we might call a skin on top of a very generic set of mechanisms. Those mechanisms basically being, well, you have kind of tile laying where you're getting tiles that have various kinds of resources on them, and the players make a bid for each tile, and then you end up either losing the bid or gaining the bid. If you gain the bid, then you get to kind of lay it out in your landscape, you get the resources there. And so that's all fine, and it has that kind of atmosphere of these elements, but this is not how people lived in Skye or in the Gaelic world generally. This could be anything. It could be, feudal France. It could be, early modern Germany. There's nothing here that tells you how Gaels lived and what they did. There's a very recent game called Tír na nÓg, and it's got these, beautiful artwork, these cards that have the names of various characters from the Fenian tales and little synopses of some of the tales. But again, it's kind of window dressing. Now it's beautifully done, and I would love to have the cards just sitting around in a frame or something, because it's very aesthetically pleasing. But the mechanisms in the game it's the same kind of thing. Like they created the mechanisms first. They said this is a cool set of mechanisms for playing a strategic game. What kind of setting can we find in which we can put these mechanisms to give it a flavor? And then they found Gaelic stuff and decided to use that. But again, this tells you nothing about Gaelic culture unless you read the cards. What you're doing in the game bears no resemblance or relationship to the Gaelic world. We get a little bit better when we come to this game called Inish. Now, Inish is using elements of the early Gaelic past, especially from Ireland. And they use this really beautiful, amazing artwork from Jim Fitzpatrick that I've admired since I was a teenager. Really beautiful stuff. And they're using certain cards that have names of characters and certain motifs and scenarios from the early medieval literature. However, again, kind of what you're doing in the game doesn't really say anything about the Gaelic past. You're laying out these tiles in a kind of random landscape that doesn't correspond to any real landscape. And you're doing this thing called area influence, doing very simple combat. So, you might learn something about Gaelic history and mythology from the contents of the cards and some of the ideas and motifs. But again, it doesn't model anything from the Gaelic world. And you might not learn very much, even though it might feel like you're in this immersive Gaelic world. Now, this is on my list of things to get. I haven't played it yet. I've just kind of watched videos and read about it. But we're kind of moving toward the right direction, but we're not there yet with this. This is another game based on the Gaelic past, and more specifically about Ireland. So in this game, you have a map of Ireland here and various major settlements and provinces of Ireland. So you can see the geography and the kind of the political geography of Ireland from the game board. And then when you play the game, you've got various cards. Again, very nice artwork, various names of people from that time period, about the 11th century of Irish, sort of Pan-Gaelic, but mostly Irish-centered history. And with these cards, you are doing things that give you either greater territorial power or influence in the church or strategic marriages, or some power against the Vikings through these kind of card mechanisms. But again, it's in a way it's kind of generic. It could be set almost anywhere. The mechanisms of the game are not modeling anything specific about medieval Ireland, except to tell you that territorial power was important, the church was important, strategic marriages were important, and the Vikings were there. You find that out, but you're not really doing anything necessarily that models or mirrors what medieval Gaels did. Now, I found that there is a game that was created in Ireland through the medium of Irish, meant to be played in Irish, and it uses characters from folk tales, and it is a children's game. I think it's something like 8 and above or 10 above or something like that. And I know somebody, Natasha Sumner, who owns a copy, but I have not played it myself, and I haven't even been able to find really any specific information about it. So it looks interesting, and it looks like something that would be fun to do through the medium of Irish with, people of all ages, basically. But I can't say much about it. So there has been at least one attempt to do something in Irish, with their own native cultural elements. But I can't say much about it. In the case of Scottish Gaelic, there was a game that came out, I think about 5 years ago, called Ciste Uli na Halba, the treasure chest of Scotland. And in this game, it's essentially like Trivial Pursuit. You have to go around the map of Scotland, and you're trying to collect 5 letters to spell the word Ciste. And you get each letter from a different territory in Scotland. You go around and you have various ways of getting punished or rewarded. And I played it this summer with Ruadi Machlean. It was fun. I don't think that, I'm just not a big fan of Trivial Pursuit in general, because you don't know how easy or hard the question is going to be, and then you might argue with the answer. Quite often I find some of the answers are arguable. So those are some of my caveats about the game. But certainly, I played it with Ruadi, and I think my daughter sat in on some of it. And we did it all in Gaelic, so that was great. But of course, this is just one game. There could be so many more. And then fairly recently, you might know, the game of Scrabble was adapted to work with the Gaelic alphabet and with the frequency of letters in Gaelic, the Gaelic lexicon. And I know at least one person here who has Scrabble. I haven't played it yet, but I do enjoy Scrabble. Even when I play Scrabble in English, I get interference from other languages. So I'd be curious to see how easy I could focus on Gaelic words when I was playing Scrabble. The only drawback, I would say, with Scrabble is that you have to have a very high level of vocabulary and fluency in Gaelic in order to play it. And ideally, we should have many inroads or ways of engaging with various aspects of Gaelic tradition in these games. So about my own process, about what I'm doing about board games, about or centered around Gaelic. So the games that I'm working on, I'm currently working on 4 different games. They are not specifically about teaching the language. So there are games that I think are very good for teaching the language, but these are rather games based on Gaelic tradition, history, culture, that can be played through the medium of Gaelic or through English, but they're representing the Gaelic world in ways that are based in the culture and the society, and things that feel representative rather than just window dressing. And the process that I've gone through for designing these games go roughly like this, and I think this would be a general guideline for folks that are interested in doing this. So first of all, identify some kind of scenario, like what is the time period, who are the characters involved, what are you trying to model in general, what's the story behind it. And then having done that, how do you create the arc of the game? Like, what is the end goal? And how do you get from the beginning of the game to the end goal? Like, are you trying to take over territory? Are you trying to replenish the land? Are you trying to, say that game about centering the non-human? What if we had a Gaelic game in which players are playing the Sheehan, the Hoodishkin, the Glashtikin? You don't have to be humans. There's various aspects of Gaelic culture that can be drawn upon in ways that are really novel and imaginative. And then think about, what are you trying to model? Are you trying to model the economy? Are you trying to model, various relationships between various people in the Gaelic world? Or, the conflict between the Gaelic world and the Norse world, or the Anglophone world, or whatever. And then having done that, kind of from the top down, then how do you find mechanics that exist to allow you to model that and create an actual playable game out of it? And then, having done that, you actually have to get people to sit down and try it out. Because quite often, when I sit at my computer and I sketch out a design and I do some architecture, I find out, well, that didn't quite work out as well as I thought it was going to. You have to really play it. So what I'm creating, first of all, I've got this little word game based on the Ogham alphabet, in which players are competing in various ways to construct or deconstruct words. And I've got a contract with a company in Ireland. They're going to be producing it hopefully next year, and I'm very excited about this coming out because you don't have to have any Gaelic to play it. I think it'll introduce people both, so it's playable both in or for Irish and Scottish Gaelic, to a number of aspects of Gaelic words and history. I've got then 3 other games that are based on the Fenian tales, and one of the major dynamics in the tales is that conflict between the native Gaels who are defending their territory against these invading Vikings. So that kind of creates the tension of these games. And one of them is a 2-player game in which you're kind of creating this tiled landscape and competing with each other over the landscape, including with the control of shillings. So you need, in this kind of game, you need an economy. What is your wealth? What is your currency? Well, in the Gaelic world, that was cattle, right? So in order to have cattle, you need shillings. In order to have shillings, you have to have territory. So that's the dynamic in that game. I've got a 2 to 4 player game, which is a semi-cooperative game, which is played on a big map. And you are, again, all the players are representing Gaelic factions that are defending the territory against the invading Vikings. And I'll show you a picture of those 2. And the Vikings are sort of played by the game itself. And then finally, I'm working on a role-playing game, which, again, the players are representing the major characters in the Fenian tales in this conflict, primarily against the Vikings, but also against the ambitious elite who are jealous of the powers of the field. A couple of pictures. Credits to my best and most important playtester, that being my daughter Roisin. My daughter Roisin, I've only ever spoken Gaelic to her since she was born, and games are one of many things that we do together to use Gaelic, and all the games we play through the medium of Gaelic, and this is a prototype of that tile-laying game that I'm working on, which she was the first and major playtester for. This is the 2 to 4 player semi-cooperative game played on that map there of Scotland and Ireland, in which you're defending territory against the Vikings that are automated by the game. Now I'm running a little bit over time, but I'm hoping that we have time for any questions that might arise amongst you, people online or in the audience. Happy. H&B. Yes, so Badi's asking about what prototypes I have available with me, and I have prototypes of all the games. Now, the role-playing game is something I'm actually kind of gutting it and redoing the design, so that's the least developed or the most furthest behind. But the other games, I do have a certain person in the audience has played 2 of them, and I'm eager to play them all, especially the 3 that are playable at this point with folks that are interested. So yes, they're in my room, ready for deployment. Christina. It's game night, yeah. When are you coming? Christina.
Relating a bit to online gaming, that's okay. They do acknowledge that you said that but have you studied the effect of making local connections using games? And I think they're specifically talking about elementary school age students being able to connect with, say, our students here at this being able to
Okay, so the question is about the ability to connect online, across large distances between small groups, like for example, school children. And I mean, I haven't looked into that. I know that is one of the benefits that you can get from the internet and from these electronic connections. It would be great if people were interested in playing the games that way. But I mean, at this point, I'm just trying to design these games and see where I can take them after they're really playable. And I certainly hope with the Algrim game in particular, it's a very low entry, a low bar. Like, it's very easy to learn it, and you can learn a lot about the words. Last night I play tested it with a mother and her daughter who is, I think she's 12, the daughter, and she is learning Gaelic, I think, in the school in Kagama, and certainly at the Gaelic College in the summer. And she really enjoyed it and was excited about sharing it with her teacher and her classmates. So I think the games could be something that could be used in a school setting, just to sort of brighten things up and say, look at this cool thing that's related to Gaelic. We don't have to play games about medieval France or World War II or whatever. We can play games that tell us something about our own history. Yes.
You talked a lot about how these games can kind of be played in English and Gaelic. Is there an existing published game that you think is, or that you would like to see in the totally Gaelic version of?
Okay, so the game is about, the question is about if there are games that could be translated or at least repurposed in a Gaelic context. And, I think like the two games that I talked about, I think it would be really cool if the publishers would be willing to do, some kind of supplement to it to make them playable in Gaelic, particularly Inish and Brian Peru. Given that, the setting is already very Gaelic, so I could see that a translation would be very feasible. The question then would be, how do you work with the company? Do you ask them about getting a grant to translate it into Gaelic, or do you say, well, let's just create a new rule book which is all written in Gaelic or something like that? Because one of the issues is terminology, and that's why I'm hoping anyway for these games to create a rule book which is bilingual, because even amongst the Gaelic speaking community, a lot of people don't have words for things like turn or round or throwing dice or whatever, because it's not been an active part of vocabulary for most people for generations. And that's one of the challenges of language revitalization is, because the domains have shrunk so much, a lot of vocabulary is lost and people don't have it readily available to make use for it, which is why it's useful to put these things into schools, because then children learn it like they learn everything else and it becomes natural.
What's the process for getting the games produced? You have to do some other company for doing for them? How do you go about doing that?
Okay, so Sheen has asked about how do you go about going from a design and a concept to an actual finished product. And one thing I didn't say that I probably should have mentioned is, this is a huge market for board games. And a huge number of the games that are out there have been, fairly small operations. So a lot of games are run through something called Kickstarter. So people will have a concept. So just to sort of back up, there's a very strong spirit, at least up to the present, of independent, small-scale game makers. So they come up with a concept, they create a prototype, and then they create kind of this campaign that they put on Kickstarter. And they'll raise a huge amount of money by people who want to see it created. And then having that seed money, they take the seed money and they actually produce the physical game. And the people who bought into the Kickstarter campaign get that sometimes a little bit fancier version of the game. And then they have the capital to then produce a mass-produced game that can go into stores. So there is kind of a very well-developed path now for how to go from a concept into kind of self-starting business. Now, personally, I don't really want to try starting a business at my age. I would rather just create concepts and prototypes and sell to a game company. I just don't have the energy for thinking about business. If any of you in the Gaelic world want to do this for me, let's talk. But I just want to work on the concepts and the games. But it is, like, one of the cool things about board games right now is it is possible for a small company to start up, get seed money, and produce something independently. FTL.
Do you know a resource for the terminology for board games, like those phrases and terms that we don't
Yeah, so resource for the terminology. That's a good question. I know people, I've kind of developed and used my own because I play all these games with my daughter. Some of the terms I got from John McInnes. Others I've just picked up here and there. It would be interesting to look at the rule books for Scrabble and for that other game, Kishta and Halapa, just to see what they have. I haven't read them actually, so I don't know. But I think amongst those things, and probably Michael Bauer would be a really good resource. It would be an interesting exercise, maybe Robbie McLeod as well, for a group to get together and say, okay, what is the set of terms that we would need, and let's kind of see if we can find and agree upon a common set so that people have that grounding about what they mean and what to use. But as far as I know, that exercise has yet to be done. Well, time for and cheating, and many thanks for coming. I guess I'm in August, the meeting, and you faram Tàilisg, and the noun